Hi guys, Assalamu alaikum. How are you all doing? Can you hear me? So we are going to be discussing. This is the recent paper, May June 25, paper 21. This is variant 1 and question 3. Question 2 is relatively easier, so I thought maybe not do that. Let's discuss question 3. Um, now, basically, okay, so before I start, just share the live stream link with your friends and peers who are also appearing in October, November, so that more and more people can join. Anyways, the first question says, with the help of a diagram, explain how changes in a subsidy can influence the price and quantity sold of a product in a market, and consider how expenditure on a subsidy is affected by the BD. Now, one problem that, firstly, what you need to do is that remember that whenever you hear a question, whenever you read the question in the exam, whatever has been taught to you about that topic, so let's say if this represents everything that has been taught to you and this represents everything that has been learned in your head, so you need to sort of extract things and connect different points from it and not just give out information in the exam that what you have learned without really connecting to the question and without really answering the question itself, right? Because even if you know everything on subsidies but you're not answering the exact question, you will not get the marks, despite the fact that you ended up writing a very good essay on subsidies but not answered the actual question. So part A is point-based marking. Point-based marking means point-based marking does not mean that you have to write in points. It means that you will be marked on the exact point that you're writing, and only those marks will be given which is for that particular point that you're writing. That is point-based marking. So you write a point, you give that mark point mark, as compared to level-based mark. That's a more holistic overall judgment on your marks, right? Also in part A, 8 markers, the essay should be relatively short. I'm not saying should be, it's because you need to finish the paper on time as well. So there's no point in writing a very good essay, very good one essay, but very bad of the other essay. Okay, so it should be a good essay, even if it's not the very best. It should be a good essay, and a good essay is good to go for an A. So the question says, with the help of a diagram, explain how changes. With the help of a diagram, explain how changes. With the help of a diagram, so if I were to answer this exam question, I would say with the help of a diagram. So I'm like, oh, you know what? I need to draw a diagram. Explain is another keyword, and then how. So it's saying explain how. How means you need to go into the process. Changes in a subsidy can influence the price and the quantity that is sold. Technically, this is the equilibrium part. And consider how the expenditure on a subsidy is affected by the PED. So, and consider how is it affected by the PED would be, this part would be the evaluation plus your conclusion, right? Okay. Now, the fact that one thing I'm going to tell you, and this is a golden tip that you must remember, that whenever the question comes changes, whenever the word changes is written, or right, so you need to, the changes could be in either way. So subsidy, changes in subsidy, right? So subsidy could either increase, it could decrease as well. So you need to explain from both perspectives, because they are saying changes. So whenever the question comes on changes or anything that could either go up or down, and they haven't mentioned whether they are talking about increase in subsidy or whether they are talking about a decrease in subsidy, they haven't mentioned that. You need to explain both, increase, decrease, both. And since they are explicitly saying with the help of a diagram, means that you have to draw the diagram, which means that you have to draw the diagram for increase in subsidy and for the diagram for decrease in subsidy. So majority of the students, what they end up doing is that they usually for this paper, usually they explained from the perspective of what do you say, increase in subsidy, but they totally excluded the decrease in subsidy part. And hence, if you are not going to do that, if you will not include the decrease in subsidy part in your answer, your 1 mark would not be given. You will not get 1 mark. And so even if you're saying, oh, you know what, I didn't include decrease in subsidy, but I wrote every other point. So shouldn't? No. Point-based marking, this is the point-based marking. If it is expected to draw the diagram for a decrease in subsidy and explain that, then even if everything else is right, so nothing else could compensate for that. But in a level-based marking, if you miss out something, but overall it's good, you will be marked. But in a level-based marking, it's more stricter. Don't think that it's more lenient there. It's more stricter in level-based marking. Relatively, it's lenient in point-based marking. So if this has to be done, then this point mark has to be given. So it's point-based, meaning that if you do not draw the diagram for decrease in subsidy or explain that, you will not get the mark. So now I have written a time-based solution, means that exact in how much time you can write this. So you'll start off by defining the subsidy. You'll say a subsidy is a sum of money. It's a government grant given by the government to producers. The aim is to reduce costs and encourage output. Then you say that subsidies, first explain what it does. You say subsidies shift the supply curve because they effectively lower the cost of production per unit. So they effectively, giving the subsidy means that it increases it shifts the supply to the right and it lowers the cost, basically lowers the cost per unit. That's why. So you first tell that why supply shifts, because it lowers the cost per unit, right? Then you say an increase in subsidy shifts the supply curve to the right from S to S1, as you can see in diagram A. This causes, so you see, this is the analysis that you're doing, right? You're explaining the cause-effect relation. So you say this causes the equilibrium price to fall from P to P1 and equilibrium quantity to rise from Q to Q. So you need to explain that. And alternatively, you can write conversely, apart from conversely, you can say alternatively, or on the contrary, a decrease in subsidy shifts the supply curve leftward, raising the price and lowering the equilibrium quantity. And this can be seen in diagram A and B above. So you can see the diagrams A and B that I have drawn, and that's how you get 3. So up till now, you'll get 3 marks for this, right? So always remember, so when they're explicitly asking with the help of a diagram, so diagram marks are included in assessment objective 1. Remember that, knowledge and understanding. So all this part, the definition and the diagram part, is covered in knowledge and understanding, 3 marks for it. Got it? So for questions where they explicitly ask you to draw the diagram, and for diagram questions. Anyways, the next part of the question says, and explain how, and then it says how, and consider how the how you need to explain the influence on price and quantity sold, and consider how the expenditure is affected by the PD. Right? So now here you need to sort of tell that what really, you need to explain the process, because the question was asking about explain how the changes, right? So now the explanation, the analysis part kicks in. So you will say that subsidies directly affect market outcomes, right? This is the analysis part. It affects market outcomes by lowering producers' cost, and this price encourages greater consumption, right? So lowering producer cost, increasing greater consumption, while higher quantity sold, because the fact that you're selling a higher quantity, it reflects producers' willingness to supply more at every price, and that is exactly where the supply curve shifts outwards. So for instance, subsidies on agricultural products may help to keep food prices lower. It's not necessary that you give the agricultural example here. I have given, just because while typing this answer out, I just wrote it, but it's not necessary that you also give us agricultural, but anything you can say. So for instance, subsidies on products may help to keep food prices lower, benefiting consumers. So you mentioned the benefit of the consumers and ensuring producers maintain revenues, because producers love subsidy. They love it because on top of the equilibrium price, they get an additional amount of the subsidy. So they're able to maintain good revenues. In fact, their revenues go up, right? So on the other hand, reducing or removing a subsidy. Now, this is all the analysis, right? The diagram was part of your knowledge and understanding. So on the other hand, reducing or removing a subsidy raises the price, it lowers the output, and could discourage consumption, as seen with energy subsidies being cut in some economies, right? You can give a reference, but it's not necessary that you need to talk about energy subsidies. You can say that and this could discourage consumption. As we can see that but that it could discourage consumption, maybe you could have ended this. This is, you can live without writing this as well. Okay. So this is your analysis, right? Up till now, any questions clear? So this is how. So the first, so explain how. So before solving the answer, plan the answer, right? Plan the answer, that what you sort of need to write in this answer. So then you say subsidies directly affect market outcomes by lowering producers' cost. Subsidies directly affect market outcomes by lowering producers' cost. The reduced price encourages consumption. While अच्छा ये तो हो गया. अच्छा, then the next part is that you sort of say explain how changes in subsidy can influence the price and quantity sold, and consider how expenditure on subsidy is affected by the PED. So what do you think would be the answer for this? How do you think you would need to sort of how will you sort of mention this कि भाई expenditure on subsidy would have an impact on the PED. Syed Mustafa says, don't mind me, this guy's a money grabber, just a greedy man with no regards for the country situation and no empathy for his own countrymen. Thank you, Mustafa. I appreciate your emotion. You're welcome. Anyways, so the question says, and consider how expenditure on a subsidy is affected by the PD. Yes, Khatija, what do you think you will write? Ke bhai, how expenditure how the expenditure on subsidy is affected by the PD? What do you think would be the answer for this? And consider how expenditure is affected by the PED. So expenditure being affected by the PED, so usually what sort of happens is that usually subsidy pe jo, whenever these sort of question comes, they usually ask about the impact on consumers or the impact that they could have on price and quantity, and how does PED or let's say PES could affect that. But this time they have asked a very different question, and they have asked for the first time. They've actually asked for the first time that how the expenditure on a subsidy would be affected by the PED. G. So what do you think? What do you think you would? What do you think would be the answer to this? Like, how would the expenditure? No, expenditure on a subsidy basically means government expenditure on the subsidy, right? And if I were to give you a hint, like the government expenditure on a subsidy is basically influenced by the cost of subsidy to the government. And that is basically price times the quantity. That is, sorry, not the price times quantity. The subsidy per unit times the quantity that is being produced and sold in the market. That would determine the final cost to the government of the subsidy, right? So let's say if per unit subsidy is given $2 and you're producing and selling, let's say 100 units, then $200 is the cost of the subsidy. Now, how would PED be influenced by that? Any idea? What do you think? Would the cost of a subsidy go up when demand is elastic, or will it be higher when demand is inelastic? That's the question. That is what you need to address here, basically. So what do you think? What do you think would be the answer? So will it be elastic में ज़्यादा होगी, inelastic में ज़्यादा होगी? Let's see that. So basically, elastic mein the expenditure would be more because the quantity would increase by a much greater amount, and that's why overall the cost of subsidy will rise if the PD is elastic. Well, if it's inelastic, then the quantity will be relatively smaller. It would increase relatively less, right? And that's why the overall cost of the subsidy would be less as well. Because why? Because because obviously subsidy would cause the fall in price, and the price is going down, but demand won't really respond a lot in response to price fall. Then obviously less would be produced and sold as compared to what was produced and sold last time, right? And in that case, the overall subsidy cost would be lower. Exactly, Hatija. This is exactly what you will write. If demand is elastic, a subsidy will cause a relatively large increase in quantity demanded, and this increases total government expenditure on subsidy. Exactly. That is if you write it like this, you will be marked. So let's see. So expenditure on a subsidy, however, depends on here. We are starting the evaluation. Expenditure on subsidy, however, depends on the price elasticity of demand for a good. If demand is price elastic, then quantity traded, that is bought and sold, will rise relatively less. Now, the reason why quantity traded, bought and sold rises relatively less is because quantity demanded doesn't respond much, right? In relative to the price fall, as quantity demanded rises relatively less in response to price fall, and as a result, subsidy expenditure will be smaller because subsidy is equal to subsidy per unit times quantity that is being bought and sold. While on the other hand, if demand is price inelastic, the subsidy expenditure or the cost to the government of the subsidy would be smaller, right? Makes sense. Because the quantity in the market would rise relatively less even if the subsidy causes a price fall. And I remember that, in my courses, I had taught this thing. We talked about, if you guys remember, I remember teaching this in my courses, in my sessions, that if you can see that since the PD is inelastic, right, this is cost per unit of the subsidy, and if you multiply this by, look at this, the increase in the number of units here. So the overall expenditure for the subsidy, which is price times quantity, subsidy per unit times quantity, would be much less. If you look at the demand that is elastic, so it's the same per unit cost, right? But that is multiplied by a long, huge jump in output, right? So the overall cost to the government would be much higher. Is it clear? Okay. And then, is it clear, Khatija? In the end, you say, in conclusion, subsidies reduce prices, and then you conclude the answer by saying, in subsidies reduce prices and raises output by shifting supply to the right. The government's total expenditure on subsidies is, however, influenced by price elasticity of demand. That's all. This is a small to the point conclusion for an 8 marker that you say. So remember that, the conclusion always, final judgment is formed based on what you're trying to say, based on your analysis and your evaluation. Subsidies reduce prices, raise output, shift supply to the right. The government's total expenditure on subsidies is, however, influenced by the PD, and that is the end of story. Okay? So this question this answer could easily give you like an 8 on 8, and we are good to go. Easy question. Okay? And if you know your content well, if students know their content well, then scoring in economics is not a big deal. Knowing the content well, plus also knowing what to write, it's easy. Assess whether an increase in the tax on demerit goods is always the best way to reduce the consumption of such a product. Assess whether an increase in tax on demerit good is always the best way to reduce the consumption of such a product. So what will I think? I will say, okay, fine. It's a question on demerit good. Then they are explicitly talking about an increase in tax, which is obviously an indirect tax, is always the best way to reduce the consumption, right? So it's demerit goods. So this is how I'll tackle this. I'll say demerit goods, increase in tax, always the best way or not, right? So for a question like this, I need to define demerit goods. I need to talk how would a tax have an impact. then talk about the disadvantages involved, and then maybe compare it with other policies. And comparison with other policy is a must whether it's a micro question or a macro question. See, increase in tax is a government intervention in the markets, which is a microeconomic government intervention, while an increase in tax or a fiscal policy, let's say, or a monetary or supply side policy is a macroeconomic intervention. So again, comparative, and whenever they give you a government intervention method, whether it's taxes or subsidy or whatever, minimum prices, or whether it's a macroeconomic policy, you always have to compare with other policies. Okay. Khatija says minimum price. Yes, minimum price ke bare maybe you will write. You will mention, so compare it with at least two other policies. That's a good thing that you can do. So minimum prices, you can say. You can also talk about information provision and advertising, because that will tackle the root cause. So yeah, minimum pricing and your information provision. So yeah, so you'll start off the answer by saying that a demerit good is a product that is considered harmful to consumers more than they realize, right? And which tends to be overconsumed if left to the free market. And the reason why we're saying it tends to be overconsumed is, the reason why I've mentioned this in the first line is because the government is trying to reduce the consumption. So in the first line, I'm actually identifying what the problem with demerit goods is and what problem are we trying to cater. We're trying to cater the misallocation of consumption, the misallocation that is taking place in the market for demerit goods, that it is being overconsumed and hence overprovided. And the reason why it is because of two reasons. Either consumers underestimate, or because of information failure, or they completely ignore, right, the private benefits and the private costs and the external costs. They ignore the private costs, meaning they ignore the fact that what harm could alcohol or gambling or cigarette consumption, sugary drinks. You've seen these teenagers constantly consuming Coke all the time, or eating out all the time, right? And this is the sugary drinks are demerit goods. These are demerit goods. Gambling is a demerit good. Alcohol is a demerit good. So they ignore the private cost. They're because of information failure, right? And external cost, meaning what impact could it have on others or the third party, basically, or others around us, or the society as a whole, right? Society as a whole, meaning that when you talk about society as a whole, you're factoring in both the private and the external cost. But obviously, if you're underestimating or ignoring the private cost and the external cost, it will have a bad impact on society. Anyways, so common examples, you can mention some it's a 12-mark question. So आप examples वगैरह देंगे, because again you will give it's a 12-mark question, you will give the examples. Because it's a level-based marking. ठीक है? So common examples include cigarettes, alcohol, sugary drinks. So one policy often used to reduce the consumption is an indirect tax, which raises the market price of the demerit good, right? So what you say is that placing or increasing a tax on demerit goods, it shifts the supply curve upwards by the amount of the tax, because the tax raises the marginal cost of the good, which is the vertical distance between the two supply curve, which is the amount of tax per unit imposed. And this raises equilibrium price from P to P1 and reduces equilibrium quantity from Q to Q1, right? As shown in the diagram below. So, just a second. So, in theory, in economic theory, we know that higher prices would discourage consumption. So you have to first tell that the question is saying assess whether increase in tax. You have to tell the process through which how the tax on demerit good would reduce consumption. So you will say that now whether it is the best way or it is not the best way we will discuss that in evaluation. So this raises the equilibrium price and reduces the quantity, and in theory higher prices discourage consumption. So because these questions always come in the sort of exam, so I've seen students always saying reducing consumption. So okay, fine, consumption is reduced, but then first mention the discourage consumption, and hence that leads to a reduction. So use the word discourage. So it's a good word to use. And obviously that will increase government revenue as well from the tax. But then do mention that again, because you need to prove here in analysis that why tax is a good way. So it's a good way because it discourages consumption. Secondly, the revenue from the taxes can be used to fund healthcare or education programs. Now, the mistake students will make is that they'll say that the revenue from the tax could be used to spend on the economy like infrastructure. Now, dude, you don't need to mention that because you're trying to cater demerit goods problem. So say that revenue could be used to further enhance the rectification of the demerit goods overconsumption problem. That is, so government spending here should be focused on resolving the problem, not government spending in general. So it can be used to fund healthcare or education programs to further address the harm that is being caused, right? And this is one of the main advantages of using indirect tax, that it directly increases the price of the demerit good, which by law of demand reducing its consumption. Because obviously when the price goes up, it reduces the, by law of demand, as in it contracts the demand basically. Okay. So that's how indirect taxes are a helpful way, right? But the point is that the fact that demerit goods are not always going to be a success story. Indirect tax will not always going to be a success story. It's not certain that it's going to be a success story because it has its own limitations, and the fact that the effectiveness would depend upon a lot of factors, right? So over here, you also need to mention some disadvantages, like you say. So for instance, now the PD point could be used in analysis as well. And if you see the marking schemes, they're using it in analysis as a disadvantage, but then it could also be used as an evaluation. Depends on how you frame it, right? So you say that the effectiveness, for instance, depends on significantly on the PD. If demand is demerit goods is relatively inelastic, do explain what you mean here. What do you mean? So you need to explain this. That if the demand for demerit goods is relatively inelastic, for instance, cigarettes and alcohol, where consumers are addicted and they have fewer substitutes. See, it's a level-based answer. Explain what you say. Then an increase in tax will result only a small reduction in quantity demanded, and hence the overconsumption problem will still persist. So in this case, but then thing is that the government revenue will significantly rise in this case. But the impact on consumption is limited. So although government revenue is rising, but impact on consumption is limited. By contrast, if demand is more elastic, such as for sugary drinks, where substitutes exist, so demand is more elastic for sugary drinks, which is very clear because more substitute exists in terms of brands and even for healthy substitutes as well. So an increase in tax is likely to cause a relatively larger fall in consumption. This is a very good point that you should be mentioning, that I've written here. Plus, one thing that I missed to write here as well, that you can say that, however, do mention that indirect taxes are also regressive in nature, and it could have an impact on income inequalities, right? Could have an impact on income inequalities because it could have a disproportionate impact between rich and poor. Now you see, alcohol consumption or cigarette consumption or sugary drinks could be used both by rich and the poor from all income groups. So that will the increase in price will have a disproportionate effect, an imbalanced effect between impacting the rich's standard of living and their income distribution versus the poor. So the way incomes would be distributed it would widen the income inequality in society, right? So you should be mentioning, I should have mentioned here while writing, but then you can, okay? Given these limitations, now comes the fact that you suggest alternative measures. So you say, given these limitations, now here is your evaluation going on. Given these limitations, alternative or complementary policies, alternative or suggest कि भाई ठीक है, we are talking about minimum prices or whatever, but these are alternative policies or complementary. They can act as alternative policies. You learn these words, that they could act as alternative policies, or they could they can act as complementary policies. May be more effective, can be more effective, or could be more effective. Don't say will be more effective. Don't sound 100% certain because it depends. Could be, maybe, likely to be. And even if you know for some policy it's very certain, say more likely, less likely, things like that. For example, information and education campaigns, right, can address the root cause. Ab yahan, the problem is, and this also happened in the you know almost all variants where government intervention question had come. And what happened is that students do suggest alternative policy. They will end up suggesting minimum prices, and they will end up suggesting information provision. But when you're suggesting information provision, do say what do you mean by information provision? It means educational campaigns or advertising. But also mention how is that going to impact. Also mention how is that going to address the problem, which probably the indirect tax is not addressing. So how will it address the problem which indirect tax is not addressing? ठीक है, got it? ये आपने करना है. You have to do this, which means that if you're saying that if information and education campaigns can address the root cause of overconsumption, don't say information provisions is a better alternative. Now, how is it a better alternative? How exactly is it a better alternative? Because the examiner will put a question mark, which is imperfect information, because we know that consumers don't have perfect information. So instead of parenting, because indirect taxes feels parental, it feels parental, right? It feels bad because you're just increasing the prices and you're forcing them to pay a higher price. So what you can say is that instead just address the root cause, just tell them to not smoke and educate them. So by making people more aware of the health risk. But again, although this may take some time to have an effect because there's a time lag, and it is more successful over the long term or in the long run. However, minimum price, and again, so suggest two alternative policies. You see, if this question was focused on subsidies, correcting merit goods problem, again, two alternative policies. So minimum pricing policy, or the minimum prices can also be used, such as imposing a minimum price on alcohol. Now you know what minimum price does? Minimum price means that this is the minimum price that we will charge you. So you have to pay this. But the problem with taxes are, at times what producers do is that even if a tax is imposed, producers absorb that tax. They don't pass on that tax burden to consumers to prevent them from losing out. They don't want to lose their customers as well at times. But minimum prices you have to charge that price by law, right? So there's no question of whether the producer would absorb the tax or not. They have to just charge that higher price. So minimum pricing policy would be more effective, or could be more effective, because it just absorbs it. It prevents suppliers from learn this line. It prevents suppliers from absorbing the tax or offering excessively cheaper deals, right? Regulations too could be enough. You want to mention the third one. Regulations such as age restrictions and advertising bans can directly curb demand irrespective of PD. This is again a good point to mention, that you do an age restriction and you say that, you know what, from now on there won't be any alcohol ad or cigarettes ad or whatever, or these sugary drinks. There's no Coke ad running on TV anymore, right? So there's a ban. So it can directly curb demand, which is true, irrespective of PED. So in that context, these policies seem to be a little more effective than indirect tax. But then it's not that doesn't mean that we shouldn't impose taxes, because they do give us revenue. So we'll see how do we need to mention this in the judgment. See, judgment always should suggest a solution. Otherwise, this is just not a judgment. And although we call it a conclusion, but it's more of a judgment. In conclusion, So in conclusion, what you will say is, again, while an increase in tax, and I remember in my final framework workshop as well, I was always talking about that, this is how a conclusion is given. While this is true, while while fiscal policy is effective, but fiscal policy should be complemented with supply side policy. Similarly, while an increase in tax, don't say that it is not effective, while an increase in tax on demerit good can reduce consumption by raising prices, and we don't disagree, it is not always the best method. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a good method. I never wrote that it is not an effective method. I said it is not the best method, which means that I'm saying it is a method, but it is not the best method. That's what I'm saying. So you need to, but sir, doesn't that mean the same? Examiners don't mark you based on what it means or what it doesn't mean. Examiners mark you what it sounds when they read your essays, right? So its effectiveness depends on the elasticity of, because obviously it's not the best method. The reason it's not the best method is because effectiveness depends upon the PD. And in many cases where demand is inelastic, the impact on consumption is quite limited. So it won't really solve the overconsumption problem. Therefore, now you suggest a solution in judgment that therefore the best approach that you can use is a combination of taxation with other policies. It is a combination of taxation with other policies, such as education campaigns, regulations, and minimum pricing. This mix of policies tackles both the affordable. This is the thing now. This is where, so if you, let's say that if everything is correct, and by the way, if analysis is not correct, let's say you don't really prove how, let's say you don't write this part, or let's say you don't write this part. You miss out the limitations of indirect taxes, and then you come up with this, their alternative policies are better. 0 out of 4 in evaluation because your analysis didn't cover the other side. That is why a lot of the students who were sharing me their scripts were like, why are we getting a 0? Dude, your analysis was not complete. You never gave the limitations or disadvantages, or you can say the other side of the argument. That is part of analysis. So, and let's say that even if that is given, and then you write an evaluation as well, and that is correct. So from here till here would be, let's say, a 3 out of 4. But getting a perfect score on evaluation, this line would definitely give you a perfect score on evaluation, because you end up saying that this mix tackles both the affordability, and you're giving the reason why. Because this mix tackles both the affordability, because what happens is that you're making the demerit goods very expensive, because initially demerit goods are cheaper, right? And people can buy it. So you tackle both the affordability problem and the information failure associated with demerit goods, making it more effective. You're making it more effective. Hence, it is more. This is your final judgment. And a final judgment has to be there in a P2 answer. Otherwise, you will not get the 1 mark that is associated with the final judgment that you have. That's why I was saying 3 out of 4 if you don't write this. So making it more effective in achieving a sustained reduction in their consumption. The reason why we are seeing a sustained reduction in their consumption is, now you need to understand this. Let's say you impose a ban in Pakistan or in any country on cigarettes and alcohol. Let's say vapes, like vaping is a very common in teenagers these days, right? Even in adults now. And let's say you do a complete ban, and a complete ban means a very effective enforcement. Like if anyone is seen consuming vape while driving a car or in a restaurant or anywhere, law enforcement agencies just put them in jail. Now, that would definitely reduce the consumption to an extent or to a large extent, but then it won't be a sustained reduction. The reason it won't be sustained is the moment that ban is lifted, people will start vaping again. So we are saying a sustained reduction means that it would only be sustained if you address the root cause, that is, you tell these teenagers why is vaping bad and what are the health risks associated with it. Right? So there is information failure. People think that vaping is less harmful, but it is not, right? So making it more effective in achieving a sustained reduction in their consumption, and that is where you get really good marks, or level 3 marks. So level 3 marks on your AO, matlab knowledge, understanding, and analysis, and level 2. Level 2 is anywhere between 3 to 4 out of 4, and level 3 on level 3 on your knowledge, understanding, and analysis is basically 6 on between 6 on 8. Okay, so we're done with this question. Anything else for that you need to ask? Okay, so I think we are done for the live stream today. I'll see you all next week. Hopefully, all the best. You've got like what, 15 days left. A lot of students watch these live streams later on as well. So you've got like 15 days left. Make the best use of this time. This is the most crucial time that you have. Revise, revise, revise. Do more and more papers. Get them checked by your teachers. The teachers should provide feedback on it. They should exactly tell you why and where you're wrong. That is what real feedback is. Okay, guys, thank you so much, and I'll see you all next week. Allah Hafiz.